Molt bé, doncs benvinguts a la segona edició del 5è seminari sobre models de política de defensa. Avui, com sabeu, parlarem de la Haganà, l'organització d'autodefensa jueva que va operar entre els anys 1920 fins al 1948, durant el període del mandat britànic. I per fer-ho tenim avui aquí amb nosaltres el professor Alon Kadish. El professor Kadish és tinent coronel a la reserva de les Forces de Defensa d'Israel, va ser director del Departament d'Història entre els anys 2007 i 2014, alhora també va estudiar Història i Filosofia i es va doctorar en Econòmiques per la Universitat d'Oxford. També és professor emèrit de la Universitat Hebrea de Jerusalem, on continua fent de professor d'Història. I bé, ens sentim molt honrats. We're very humbled to have you here. And so, Professor Kadish, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Sam, delighted to be here. For various reasons. One is that historians like to talk about their work, regardless of whether it's interesting or not. My talk will focus on the nature of this organization called the Haganà, which was the main militia of the Jewish community in Palestine up to 1948 and the War of 1948. There were two other underground organizations which were primarily terrorists in the positive meaning of the word, if there is such a thing. And the purpose was mainly fighting the British administration. But the Haganà, as I'll try to explain, had a different purpose and a different focus, and therefore should not be considered in the same category as the other underground movements, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, the Lehi. And this perspective derives from the very circumstances of the creation of the organization, the Haganà. The Haganà was officially created, officially formed in the foundation meeting of the General Trade Union of the Jewish workers in Palestine in 1920, that is just after the British occupation during the First World War, and before the mandate system was agreed on by the precursor of the United Nations, the League of Nations, and it became the British mandate. So this is a period which is in between, and the Jewish community in Palestine reorganized itself according to how it thought it should conduct its affairs on the basis of the new reality of a British government, completely different from the Ottoman Empire. And the idea here was to create an all-inclusive workers' union based on the socialist principle that the working classes embody the interests of the whole society, and therefore it's legitimate, or therefore it's right, that the working classes will create an organization with the pretense of dealing with the problems of the whole society on all levels. And so this was nominally began as a traditional trades union, looking after the particular interests of its members in finding employment. But with the foundation in 1920 was at least the ideal, which was really a pretense, because there was nothing on the ground. There was no existence of such an organization, was it would be all inclusive, and it would provide for all the needs of the national community and provide for all forms of collective activity. So this all-embracing union was not supposed to look not solely after the interests of workers, but to go to the other extreme, also provide them with work. In other words, acquire or create means of production which would then be used to employ workers. It had its own bank, but also built its own neighborhoods according to workers' models, which probably you're aware of. The high-rises began in Germany. Schools, it had its own school system, its own food stores, food cooperatives. Of course, everything was either owned by the members, or at least the initial came owned by the whole union or by just the members employed in it. So the cooperative principle was very strong there. And sports, it had its own sports clubs, theater, and so on. And one of the points on the agenda during this first conference in 1920 was self-defense. In other words, if it caters for all the needs of society, it also has to cater for the need for defending body, lives, and property. That is, the principle is defensive. It's supposed to complete and complement the official forces and the responsibility, and the forces, the British forces on the ground in Palestine as well as elsewhere in the empire during the first years after the First World War were very thin. The whole of Palestine was supposed to be garrisoned by the Air Force, of all things, the Royal Air Force, with a limited number of planes for patrolling the borders, and some armored cars. That was it, basically. And law and order was supposed to be preserved by the police. And in times of emergency, troops were brought in from Egypt or by sea from Malta. That was it, basically. So it was realized from the outset that the Jewish community would have to provide some form of self-defense in order to deal effectively with mostly with internal threats from within the country, from the Arab population. And therefore, it was called the Haganà. Haganà means defense in Hebrew, and the name is preserved in the name of the Israeli army, which is the Israel Defense Forces. So it's all part of this concept that the main purpose is defense. The idea of a people's army was ideologically partly derived from the works of Jean Jaurès, who was translated into Hebrew and published in Hebrew, but I can't say was terribly well read by the rank and file, but there's the romantic idea of the people providing for all their own needs, self-sufficiency, including defense, as well as everything else. There were a number of other alternative models. I won't go into great detail on how this problem of defense should be dealt with. There was the idea of a small, selective, avant-garde, secretive, self-appointed elite. There was another model of an army, a native army created by under the auspices of the British Army, as was the case with the Indian Army. Some of the, in actual fact, some of these ideas eventually, because of circumstances, were incorporated into the Haganà, into the Haganà's existence, but ideologically it was decided that a people's army in which the whole community would participate was the best solution. Now, the important thing to remember here is that this is all theoretical. There were no troops on the ground. There were no funds available. This was an idea. The very strange thing about this whole concept of an all-inclusive union is that eventually it became realized. That as fantastic as it sounds from the outset, most of it, I would say even all of it, was realized by 1948. And then afterwards there's a question of its relations with the state, and eventually it began a slow process of decline, which picked up during the 70s. What existed on the ground were defense committees set up by local communities to serve their own interests, their immediate interests, if they felt under threat, potential threat or immediate threat, using their own resources, using their own manpower, purchasing their own weapons, and using the occasional expertise, military expertise, of those local residents who had served in any foreign army during the First World War, for instance, or before the First World War. I mean, one of the heroes of this period had served and lost an arm in the Russian-Japanese War, beginning of the 20th century. So the question of actual military professionalism wasn't really dealt with professionally or systematically. Anything went, anything would do. When it came to purchasing arms, the arms market in Israel or in Palestine had always been in existence and still is. In other words, if you want to buy arms, or if you need arms, if you purchase arms, all you need is money. And I mean, now it's illegal, but you still can do it. It's generally agreed that the criminal elements in Israel, both Jewish and Arab, have too many arms at their disposal. So that market is still very active if anyone is interested in investment. And so those communities who were wealthy had no problem in arming themselves. People also did it for their own needs, or you have to understand that within the culture of the Middle East, a sign of maturity and a sign of status is having your own arms. Whether you actually use them or not is irrelevant. And you have also the displays of arms, which have nothing to do with the actual use of arms, but that's an anthropological issue, very different. So those communities who had something to lose in terms of property, and fears for the safety of their property, of their possessions, and of their lives, usually created their own defense committees. For instance, one of the early semi-urban, half-urban, half-agricultural settlements, Petah Tikva, had its own committees because they were relatively affluent. They could purchase their arms. Local farmers with some sort of military experience from the Turkish army, for instance, served as instructors, and they organized a defensive system for their community. And when they were attacked by Bedouins in 1920, could put up an effective defense, at least until the British Army, which still had some troops stationed around, could intervene and stop the fighting. So this was what existed, and this was completely voluntary and dependent on whether communities felt they were in danger of any sort. And this is certainly not uniform throughout the country. These local committees accepted, by and large, accepted some sort of a form of authority of the Central Haganà organization, but the Haganà had no power of its own, no funds of its own, no troops of its own. So this is all on a voluntary basis. They could provide some help with instruction and could send instructors, its own instructors, to help in setting up local organizations and training its members. In some cases, if it was necessary, help in finding sources for arms and ammunition, but not much more than that. And their authority was accepted again on a voluntary basis. In some places, until fairly late in the day, and when I say fairly late in the day, it's beyond the establishment of the state in 1948, accepted the authority on condition. For instance, those communities who had purchased arms, first of all, kept them secret. In other words, secret from the Haganà, not necessarily secret certainly from the British, but from the Haganà, and wouldn't surrender them years afterwards to the State of Israel. And these are always hidden, well hidden underground, and this was all very secretive, and generations died out, and people forgot where these things were, and every so often, on a fairly regular basis, I mean once every few months, one of these caches of arms are discovered underground in developing a kibbutz, and it's always a great surprise, but it's part of this tradition of it's ours, we bought it with our own money, and who knows what's going to happen. This world is a very unstable place, as some of you may have noticed. The training was very basic. It was mainly the use of small arms, and in well-organized communities it was also defending the positions. They decided on a line of defense, on building up basic positions, and so on. But not much more than that. The great transformation here is the Arab Rebellion, or what was later called the Great Arab Rebellion, of the years 1936 to 1939. Now, I won't go into the history of the Palestinian national movement, but there's also a development of Palestinian national consciousness which is influenced and to a certain extent copies the forms of Zionist national aspirations and national consciousness. In other words, as the Jews succeeded in establishing at least the beginning of a national home as declared by the Balfour Declaration, this was seen by the Palestinian Arabs as a threat, and consequently the ambition was to create something similar which would serve the Palestinian population. So whereas previously they saw themselves part of the Arab movement, national movement, which expressed itself in the great, again great, if it's not great, it's not worth remembering, the Great Arab Rebellion of the Hashemites during the First World War, which was supposed to eventually establish a large Arab state with its capital in Damascus, which didn't quite work out. But affiliation shifts, the focus of national sentiment shifts from the large Arab nation to creating a Palestinian identity which would be symmetrical opposite the Zionist Jewish national movement. And the rebellion in 1936-39, although motivated by the fear of the creation of or the expansion of the Jewish community in Palestine, was directed against the British administration. So when we say the rebellion is against the British, not against the Jews, because they weren't in charge, but part of the attacks, part of the violence was directed against the Jewish population, and not only against the British troops. Eventually, this rebellion was suppressed very violently by the British Army in 1939, violently, because they were anticipating the outbreak of a war in Europe and didn't have any time to use more moderate means. So there is one element there in the transformation is the Arab revolt, and the fact that this was on a scale which wasn't experienced before. I mean, violence has always been there. Violence in the Middle East, intercommunal violence, is nothing new. It wasn't brought by the Jews. It wasn't invented by the Jews. And if you read the accounts of members of local communities, you'd have it Christian Arabs against Muslim Arabs, Bedouins against farmers, Druze against Arabs, Cherkesses from the Caucasus, which settled in Palestine during the Turkish Empire against everyone else. So violence, intercommunal violence, there's nothing new about it. The fact that Jews were just another element in that, but suddenly you have an effort which looks more like a national effort of the Arab rebellion. And it's not just limited to it's not pinpointed, but it embraces large parts of Palestine. And the scale dictated a different approach to defense. Defense would have to be better coordinated than before. It's not just every community to itself or cluster of communities, which was a lesson from a breakout of violence in 1929. But you'd have to have a more effective national coordination of mutual support, mutual reinforcements, mutual aid during times of emergency, of a direct threat. Now, one of the consequences of the outbreak of violence in 1936 was a standard British practice of, if you have a problematic situation and the standard solutions are insufficient, in other words, the police maintaining law and order, then you set up a commission of inquiry. It could be a parliamentary commission, it could be a royal commission. In this case, it was a royal commission of inquiry headed by Peel, who's descendant of the Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister Peel of the 19th century. I mentioned that just because I did some work on Peel. Never mind. And they submitted a report in 1937, and their conclusion was, the Commission of Inquiry's conclusion was, that there's no solution to the problem, the interrelations in Palestine on the basis of the mandate. Then, the concept of the mandate is prepare the local population for self-rule as a form of tutoring. This won't work out in the case of the relations between the two communities, and therefore Palestine should be partitioned. Now, this is the first time this was suggested by a British statesman, a British authority, that you'd have a partition of a Jewish state and an Arab state. Eventually, the report was rejected and was shelved. But the idea that there is a possibility, a real possibility, that under the auspices of the British Empire, the British government, a territory would be allocated for a Jewish state, meant that now you had to think about how do you defend a state, or how do you defend a whole area, and how do you maintain its sovereignty, and not just the safety of particular communities. So this meant a shift in a way of thinking and a continuous attempt to build something which resembles more a national army than just a federation, a loose federation of communities responsible for themselves. Some of this was done under the auspices and the active help of the British administration in the effort to put down the Arab rebellion, which had its ups and downs, but it intensified in 1938. And then the sense of emergency, the sense of urgency is much stronger than before because of developments in Europe. You would need the army's full attention in Europe. You couldn't afford these small clashes throughout the empire, which would draw troops which would be needed, for instance, for an expeditionary force. So we have various developments. One of them is called the Jewish settlement police. And the idea was that every Jewish community would have what would be officially a police station, but the purpose of that station, which would be manned by Jews, who would receive their salary, uniform, and arms from the police or from the government, was to protect those communities. That was their purpose. But it meant that Jews would be allowed to bear arms legally. And the arms were arms provided by the government with government ammunition, government training, and so on. Now, it's only natural in farming communities that there'd be some concern for the safety of the crops or the safety of fields, of orchards and so on, which are outside the limits of the community, of the settled community. So they had to devise various ways of operating outside the confines of the settlement itself. And this led gradual development to a mobile forces, which were supposed to patrol and mainly defend the transportation from these settlements on roads which were on, some of them traveling through areas which were controlled by Arabs. The question was, how do you protect the Jewish settlements from external attacks? And there, the other great British contribution are what were called the special night squads, set up by Wingate, which combined Jewish members of the Jewish settlement police with British troops, regular troops, from the forces which were sent to put down the rebellion in Palestine, from regular battalions of the British Army. The rationale is that the members of the Jewish settlement police have the authority of policemen. So they, for instance, can arrest Arabs, which the military cannot, because it wasn't military government, it was still the military helping the civilian government. But he taught the Haganà one important lesson, which is a military lesson. And it's inappropriate, or was seen as actually inappropriate by the previous generation of Haganà activists, and that is attacking the enemy in its bases, striving for contact, rather than just defending passively the old settlements and going beyond its confines and ambushes and so on, to actually go out, seek the enemy, and attack him in his bases. The rationale is a military rationale. In other words, you wish to attack the enemy before he attacks you. Or I don't know how many of you remember the great American police series Hill Street Blues, the instruction of the sergeant, let's do it to them before they do it to us. So the concept of you don't have to worry about revenge, retaliation, blood feuds, and so on, which are a major concern of the older generation of Haganà commanders. In other words, how to maintain the peaceful relations or the potential for peaceful relations between community. Just go out there and do it to them before they do it to you. Very different concept. So you have these changes in the understanding on all levels of what has to be done. And the bottom line is you have to create some national force. As long as the rebellion continued and the British authorities needed this various initiatives to supplement its own limited forces, limited military capability, this was allowed and in many cases encouraged by either local command or higher command and so on. Another point which is worth making about the Arab Revolt, it established what were considered as standard threats whenever future outbreaks of violence, that is the safety of the roads, of road transport, because the railways were owned by the government. The railways were another matter, and the Jewish economy was based on road haulage. The danger in clashes within mixed cities between Arab and Jewish neighborhoods, for instance, between Jaffa and Tel Aviv, or the Arab community in Haifa and the Jewish community in Haifa, certainly the case in Jerusalem, and the threat of attack on Jewish isolated communities with the intention of destroying them. Then the next major change, with a very similar purpose in mind, is the Palestinian Jews' participation in the Second World War on the side of Britain. And there was an effort, a concentrated effort by the leadership, the political leadership of the Jewish community, it's called the Yishuv, to encourage Jews, because of course they couldn't force it, encourage Jews to join the British Army and gain experience in what an army looks like, how do you organize it, how do you train it, how do you employ it in the field. It started off with pioneers, drivers, and various professionals, for instance, medical staff and so on. But eventually, in a process which took a lot of pressure and a lot of effort, ended eventually in 1944 with a British agreement to establish a Jewish brigade, a Jewish infantry brigade, combat ready, which was eventually employed during the end of the war in Italy, on the Italian front. This has to do with the whole problem of the shortage of British Army manpower during the later stages of the war in the Italian front, because that was low priority for everyone else, and it was Churchill's insistence that that front was vital, so they took whoever they could, including these volunteers for Palestine, and there was a pressure, a direct pressure within the Haganà for members to volunteer to the British Army and serve with the brigade, because then they could come back with much needed expertise on how do you create an army and the techniques of fighting, modern weapons, and so on. The result was that that experience was gained, but it was a limited experience in the sense that it included infantry, artillery, field artillery, 25 pounders, engineering, combat engineering, but no armor. That is, Volunteers for Palestine did not serve in the tank corps in any way or form, and no group representation in the RAF or the Royal Navy. Although the Navy accepted volunteers, and in the RAF there were a few combat pilots who fought in the served in the RAF, and one even participated in the Battle of Britain. At the same time, through a British initiative. The Haganà created what it had always tried to do during the Arab Rebellion, ending in 1939. And it was possible, as long as the Arab Rebellion posed a threat, develop something which would resemble a standing army. Now, it was possible during the Arab Rebellion, according to needs in various parts of the country, to create some sort of standing companies which were paid for, received a salary from British funds, but as long as the danger, as long as the threat remained. Once the threat was dealt with by two British divisions, armed regular divisions, who were deployed in Palestine, that was discontinued. So there's always a search of how to renew this ideal of a standing army, and eventually this happened while the British administration was preparing for the possibility of an invasion of Palestine, either from the Western Desert, Rommel and so on, or from the spillover, the war in the Balkans, the occupation of Crete, and the question was, what's after Crete? So that was another source of another threat. But then the Germans decided to attack Russia, which is always a mistake, and there the threat was a German advance through the Caucasus towards into the Middle East. So there was a danger from a threat, or a theoretical perceived threat from various places. The question is how to organize the country for a possibility of occupation, of German and Italian occupation. And two organizations were active in providing their own solution. One is the SOE, Special Operations Executive, which was set up by the British Army, by the civilian government as part of the armed forces in order to encourage local guerrilla activity against the German occupation. For instance, Greece is a primary example. And MI6 in order to create cells which would provide intelligence of areas under occupation. One didn't necessarily know of the other. It was all very secretive and very compartmentalized. But the British technique was to approach the leaders of the local communities and ask for volunteers. And the leaders of the local Jewish community turned to Haganà, and they sent the same people to all courses, both SOE and MI6, although there are conflicting interests. SOE draws attention, MI6 tries to avoid attention of occupying a force. And that was the beginning of a new nucleus of a starting army, which became the Palmach, which was later when the threat evaporated gradually. British won the Battle of El Alamein. The Germans were stopped in Stalingrad and did not attempt to continue to advance beyond Crete. And they stopped subsidizing this activity of setting up these cells. The Haganà, I won't go into the whole process, but eventually evolved a system whereby they were maintained through a arrangement with the kibbutzim, where platoons would be stationed in kibbutzim, work for half a month, and train for the rest of the month. And this is again a form of realization of the ideal of a people's army that works in order to provide for itself. It's not dependent on the community, and the work is real work. It's actually productive for the kibbutzim. Now, this brings me to 1948. The evaluation of the situation in the summer of 1947, with the decision in the UN anticipated in the autumn of 1947, and the recommendation of the UN Committee of Inquiry was partition, was that First of all, Britain declared that it would end its mandate, regardless of what the UN decides, and withdraw from Palestine. The general assumption was that a political decision would be made by the UN, and therefore the implementation would be by the UN. And the problem is, how do you stabilize the situation and keep the violence to a tolerated level until the end of the mandate, allowing the establishment of a state, a Jewish state, besides an Arab state, which was the idea of partition, two sides of partition. And that then it was, the leaders, certainly Ben-Gurion felt fairly certain, that the problem then would be an invasion by the armies, the regular armies of the surrounding Arab states, because this was the declared intention of the Arab League, which was set up shortly before. So the idea was, first of all, the feeling was that you could contain the violence up to the end of the mandate by the British Army, the British police, and the Haganà forces. This could be done, as it had been done in 36 to 39. And as far as Ben-Gurion was concerned, this time, this period would be used to create a Jewish regular army, which could then face the invasion of the regular Arab armies. So the Haganà would provide a form of a screen which would protect the Jewish communities and help and be helped by the British Army. At the same time, a Jewish army would be created using as a nucleus the veterans of the Second World War, who had the experience of organizing an army, what it looks like, what it has to contain in terms of various professions, various arms, and so on. This didn't work out. It didn't work out because rather than contain the violence increased. And there's a process of escalation, gradual escalation, from after the partition decision on the 29th of November 1947, and it slowly escalated. At the same time, the British Army is contracting. So it can't send, it doesn't even have the ability to send serious reinforcements to deal with the escalation and violence. And the Jewish community cannot separate the two efforts of building an army and defending the existing territorial status quo. So the things are combined, and the army or the troops of the Haganà, the units of Haganà, which are responsible to defend the Jewish community, are also creating or building themselves as an army. The process is an integrated process, and training is combined with operations of a local nature, and consequently, because eventually I have to finish this. I mean, I can go on, but that's the problem of historians who like to hear themselves talk. As a result of the shortcomings, the weakness of the British Army, and the development of the Arab Palestinian forces, which in a form corresponding to the development of the Jewish forces, became more and more efficient. The Jewish forces were forced to move on the offensive. That is, they couldn't just maintain the situation where most of the Haganà was organized within its communities, training to become an army and employing small units for defensive purposes, but had to move on the offensive in order to deal with the increase in Arab military effectiveness and the weakening of the British Army in Palestine. And as a result, occupied most of the territory allocated for a Jewish state by the time the mandate ended. The assumption was this would happen only after the end of the mandate. The status quo would be maintained until the end of the mandate, and then things would become fluid. They became fluid much earlier, a month and a half earlier. And by then, the main mission of the armed forces, the Jewish armed forces, was to defend those territories which had been occupied during the months of April to mid-May, and then defend them against the invading Arab armies and move on the offensive. In other words, the army created by the state, by the newborn state of Israel, was based on a foundation of a militia, of a people's militia, of the Haganà, to which they added specialist units, they added the Air Corps, they added the Navy, and various professional arms, tank corps, although the IDF ended the War of Independence with 3 tanks. And on top of that, regular army was added, was a regular 2 units, 2 divisions, 2 brigades and another territorial brigade. So these 2 traditions existed, and to some extent, as I indicated before, elements of a people's army are still in place, including the rhetoric of a people's army, which is very effective for maintaining national myths and national self-identity. I'll stop here, but just one word by way of a bottom line. The success of the British force, of the Jewish forces in 1948, was way beyond expectation. And it was, I would say, even rightly considered as miraculous. According to all military experts, British experts, American experts, they didn't stand a chance. But they prevailed, and great victory was won. Consequently, the model of a mixed militia regular army was considered a success, and therefore influenced largely the creation of the reorganization of the IDF after the war. But the question is, how does one explain this success, which, as I say, was against the opinion of most qualified experts? And my answer is that this is part, going back to the foundation of the Haganà, this is part of an organizational genius and organizational skill of the leaders of the Yishuv who came to Palestine in what was called the second wave and the third wave, mostly from Russia and Eastern Europe, young people without families, with a strong socialist background, not to say revolutionary, pre-Russian Revolution and some after Russian Revolution. And the idea that they could create a new society which would be as self-contained as possible, collectivist, gradually the national aspirations were added onto them, but the idea was to create a new society which would be completely integrated on all levels and infused with the idea of an egalitarian socialist collectivist society. Now, without going into the whole political and ideological question, that means that in 1948, it's when we think of the concept of a total war, here was a society, pre-state, able to create the type of effort of a total war by mobilizing almost all its resources. Now think about the organizational skill which is required there. So it isn't the Haganà in itself, but the Haganà of being part of a more general organizational structure which was not created primarily for the purpose of fighting a war. in the same way that most national communities aren't in existence solely for the purpose of waging war, but they're being centralized, and if they're lucky, they have an effective government able in times of national emergency to mobilize all efforts. So there isn't a state, and there isn't a state government with its police and with its laws, but the effect is the same. And that's something worth thinking about, how the ability to organize a society on that level can serve that particular purpose, but that is not necessarily the reason why this organization was created or what its rationale for existence is. And that's it.
Thank you. Now we'll proceed with the Q&A.
Certainly.
Molt bé, doncs, com sabeu, sempre procurem que les conferències del seminari siguin el màxim d'interactives possibles. Així doncs, és el vostre torn i podeu fer les preguntes que considereu pertinents. Ja ho sabeu, tenim ben bé 3 quarts d'hora, diria, o sigui que s'ha ajustat bastant. Sí, ben bé, mitja horeta ben bé. Molt bé, doncs, vosaltres mateixos.
I have one question.
Shoot
Can
away.
you explain? Well, I have my own idea, but I want to know your point of view. How it's possible that a national movement based on socialist ideas, Ben-Gurion was socialist, and kibbutz and so collectivism and so on, has evolved to no, I don't know if far-right, but right movement. I mean, today Israel is mainly governed by right-wing parties. It's based on the need of self-defense in front of the foreign aggression, or are there any other explanation?
One of the characteristics of historians, or at least history teachers, is to complicate matters rather than simplify them. So the answer, by definition, is complicated rather than simple. But you have a shift. Ben-Gurion believed in etatism. In other words, the state would take over all voluntary efforts in everything, in defense, in settlement. This would all be government initiatives and voluntary associations and organizations, which many of them were socialist in nature, were replaced by government agencies and government initiatives. So that's one stage. The other stage, I mean, it would be extreme to argue that Israel is a rightist state, because the current government is center-left rather than center-right. And the fight is still on. I mean, we have an election in 2 weeks. We'll see where that goes. But it seems to be that the population is split down the middle between right and left. But to give it a more focused answer, it was decided that, Ben-Gurion decided, that Israel orientation would be towards the West rather than towards the Soviet bloc, for a variety of reasons. And this included the importation of the Western economic systems, which would replace a planned economy of socialist orientation. And this included values of capitalism, free trade, free market, and so on. So there you have a shift, which initially was not necessarily a ideological shift, or not recognized as an ideological shift, but of course it has its ideological consequences and tragical implications. So it certainly became less socialist. But socialism still exists in one form or another. And as I say, the electorate is split down the middle. And may have to come up with a different answer in 2 weeks' time. I hope not.
Yes, I wanted to ask, because you said that during World War II that the British actually had problems keeping order in the Palestine region. And why didn't the Haganà push for independence instead of helping the British suffocate the Arab rebellion?
Oh, it pushed for independence all along the way, but that was not in the interest of the British Empire. The British Empire, again, you have to see it from British highways, through British highways. Its main concern, which increased towards 1938 and 1939, you see, the British Army, the British High Command, defined the most immediate threat to Britain as Germany as of 1934, or the end of 1933. Now that meant that it had to ensure stability throughout the empire. And they were very fearful of what would happen if the British Army had to go to war in Europe and rebellion or violence would erupt in the Middle East. The problem was not the Palestinians, the problem was the whole Middle East. Also the romantic association with the ideal of an Arab nation, a unified nation, which would might turn against the British. And in fact, there was, for instance, a rebellion in Iraq, the Rashid Ali al-Kalyani rebellion, which was pro-German in 1940. There was a very strong opposition to British rule in Egypt, of Egyptian nationalism. And the fear was that if Britain accepted, for whatever reasons, the claims of Jewish national independence, the result would be a strong anti-British feeling in the Arab world. And this goes beyond the Arab world. There's a constant fear in Britain, realistic or not, of what the reaction would be of the Indian Muslims. And this is sort of a leitmotif throughout discussions of world situation, or the Middle Eastern situation. How would the Muslims in India react to developments in the Middle East and Palestine in particular? So there was no way they felt they could afford to respond favorably. And in fact, the demands of the Jewish leadership to allow its own units to serve in the British Army under a British and a Jewish flag, or the Jewish national flag, were resisted until conditions were such that they had to accept any help from anywhere, which towards the end of the war was the case.
But I don't understand why the Haganà, or why the Jewish community at large, chose to cooperate with the British instead of pushing for their own independence.
How could they? They hadn't the ability, they hadn't the resources, they hadn't the manpower. You must understand, the Jewish community in Palestine in 1947 is 600,000. And that's against twice that number of Palestinian Arabs. It simply wasn't feasible. And the idea was that they should gather force and create the ability so that when the time comes, they could provide some sort of an effective defense. The other thing is that the understanding was that this was a political issue and would be decided in political channels, as was the case with the partition decision by the UN. But the mistake was that the assumption was that implementation would be done by the same international bodies, whereas in fact, at that point, from that point on, the UN had failed in carrying it through. But the idea was to prepare, and they felt unprepared during the Second World War.
Més preguntes?
Hello, good evening. I would like to understand your opinion regarding the success in 1948. You described the Haganà as a sort of three parts army, a militia, soul, sort of a skeleton of the British administration that essentially was who organized as a police force, and finally the participation of portion of its elements in the World War II. Second World War. So, which of these three elements do you believe were most important in the success in the 1948?
I'd say everything. But I think it's a question I've lectured on quite a lot because it's not seriously dealt with by my colleagues and historians. The reasons for the success. The initial reason, which was given, which are mostly a rhetorical reason, is the sense of back to the wall. The Jewish community had no chances to survive anything but victory. I mean, otherwise, defeat was unthinkable. And this rationale prevailed for many years afterwards. So it was mostly a question of morale and the will to fight. And then the second reason which was given, which became very popular, and is true, I mean, in the same sense, the sense of the back to the wall was true, was that the Jewish community had an effective leadership whose authority was generally accepted by the whole community. Even if they disagreed with the leadership of Ben-Gurion, they accepted his authority, and many disagreed. But they said, well, he's the leader, he's in charge, and what he says goes. There's no comparable leadership in the Palestinian community. The Palestinian community is divided against itself, and local leaders follow very different policies from the central leadership of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. The Arab countries who invaded Palestine do so in order to serve their own interests. And the interests of Egypt, by means of the presence of the Egyptian army in Palestine, are very different from the Jordanian or the Syrian. So even there you don't have a unified front or a unified effort. And the advantage there of the Jewish army was the ability to operate on internal lines and concentrate effort in various fronts, move its troops from one place to another. Administration, the British administration allowed the creation of a Jewish communal administration, which looked after, because it saved money and it saved effort. So, for instance, the Jewish economy was not dependent, or not entirely dependent, on the Jewish on the British imperial economy. Let me give you just one example. This goes to what I think I mentioned: the genius or the ideal of organizing the whole society, and the capability there. And this is something I'm working on now, so I'm very keen to talk about it, because towards the end of, when the Second World War ended, the British and American armies in the Middle East, because there was also an American component, decided that it wasn't going to transfer all its stock back to Britain or the US. For instance, trucks and staff cars. It did not need all these trucks and staff cars. The idea in the British government was to reduce the army back to pre-war levels. The army didn't need all those many trucks and those many vehicles. And the question was what to do with them. And it was decided that they would be sold at a discount to discharged soldiers. And this was a way of compensating in Palestine the Palestinian Jews who served in the British Army, because they were paid less, because they were colonial soldiers, were paid less than British soldiers. So a discount was allowed, and trucks and staff cars became available. Now, on one level, the Jewish community organized to provide various channels, credit and financial aid to soldiers discharged, to enable them or give them a sort of some sort of help in establishing new lives, and starting their new lives, and in taking into consideration the time they spent in the army. But then the Histadrut decided, through its cooperative wing, that it would apply to the British government that all vehicles the army wished to dispense with would be sold to them. There's a central office would purchase, with the financial backing of the Histadrut and the national leadership, would purchase all these vehicles and sell them to the discharged soldiers. This was very convenient for the British government, because they didn't have to deal with one item at a time, but could sell bulk of 200 vehicles, that's how it started, to just one customer whose credit was good, who would pay for it. Then the Histadrut decides who's going to be allowed to purchase these cars, and of course their priorities were cooperatives, because they were associated with the trade union. What does all this mean? An economic effort, which has nothing to do with the 1948 war in terms of its rationale, its original, the reasons for doing it, meant, going back to what I mentioned before, the ability of the Israeli army to operate on short lines, internal lines. In other words, it had the vehicles to move troops from one side of the country to the other. To do that, you need the trucks. To supply them, you need the trucks. Suddenly there are trucks. Now, this is a development that had nothing to do with preparation for war, but was very significant to the conduct of war. So you have here developments which are part of the history of the British rule in Palestine, of the efforts of the Jewish community to use any opportunity to develop its economy, of the Histadrut trying to organize everything under its own auspices, and it becomes a multiplier when it comes to military ability, military capability. So what I'm trying to say is that the answer, by necessity, is a complicated answer. Personally, I think that consequently it's also a more interesting answer. But that's because I'm working on it, and
En tenim tres, una, dues, Helena.
I would like to know why the British did support at this era in some way the Jewish movement, if the easiest way to end with the problem was supporting the Arabs and let the Arabs do the thing to the Jews.
The British policy was mainly to support the British. And that meant supporting the Zionist movement when it was convenient. And in 1939, it stopped being convenient because of the fears of the Arab reaction after it managed to repress the Arab rebellion, was what was called the White Paper, which limited Jewish immigration into Palestine, which after the outbreak of war gradually ceased to be a problem because most of them were killed massacred in Europe, but limited the Jewish ability to purchase lands in Palestine. So this was considered a anti-Jewish policy, and the result were demonstrations and Jewish activity on various levels, including violent levels against the government. At the time, one of the battle cries of the Arab popular organizations was, "The government is with us." In other words, the British government is with us. Now, your question is dependent on, or the answer to your question is dependent on who you ask. The Arabs at the time, in 1948, were convinced that the British were on the Jewish side. The Jewish belief, which was almost universal, and in some respects counterfactual, was that the British are on the Arab side. Everyone was convinced that the British are against them. It's impossible in a national movement, to consider that one of the players has different interests, and his interests are not necessarily the welfare of the Jews. It's not necessarily the welfare of the Arabs. But in the case of the Labour government after 1948, is creating a new Britain for the British. So, if you look at it from the point of view of the Israelis or the point of view of Arabs, it seems inconsistent, but because true nationalists tend to be paranoid, it's always against them. But it's neither. The only way I can make any sense of British policy is if I assume that it's meant to serve British interests. And sometimes it can be interpreted as pro-Zionist, sometimes it's pro-Arab or pro-Palestinian, but that's not the purpose, the initial purpose.
As far as I have understood, you're telling that Haganà never fought the British.
It did for a very short period. A very short period after 1945, when it was felt that you needed some form of armed resistance in order to counter the White Paper policy, which was contrary to election, the platform on which the Labour government ran during the 1945 election. It adopted that policy, which was originally a conservative policy, and it was felt that some sort of armed resistance was required. It was very short-lived, and the understanding was that the British reaction was such to violent attacks by the Jewish community was such that it endangered the building of a future capability to defend itself, or the creation of an army. So it was stopped, and instead they concentrated on illegal immigration as a way of trying to change the balance of power in Palestine, demographic power. But it was very short-lived. The èxits, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, of course, it was a very different story because their purpose, they defined the British as the main enemy, not the Arabs. Eventually they had to change, during 48, change their position, but as long as they could fight, they were happy.
I have two questions. The first one is on the Jewish brigade, to which level Jewish people at what is the highest ranking Jew in the Jewish brigade, and what kind of training they get from the British? And my second question is about the role of those minor groups, such as Irgun and Be'i, and etc. Thank you.
The Jewish brigade, some Palestinian Jews went through officer course and made the highest rank, I think, was major. I think there may have been a case or two of lieutenant colonels, which is all right because the main effective formations during the War of Independence were battalions, and within the organizational structure of brigades. So they learned the art of fighting in large formations during the war, but they were given a very considerable head start by training in the British Army, and some experience which was gained during the last battles in northern Italy, the last months of the war. Some went through staff college, and there was some training for that level, serious training. And there were some Jewish soldiers from other country who came to the aid of the IDF in its formative years. And the greatest help was given in establishing the Air Force by foreign volunteers, and truth has to be said, by foreign mercenaries. As to of course, the Etzel and the Irgun and and Lehi, the Stern Gang, are convinced that they forced the British out of Palestine. They were clearly a nuisance, and required a British effort to deal with them. But if under a different government, i.e., a conservative government, more strongly committed to maintaining the empire, because the Labour government was far less committed to the empire, was interested in creating a new society in Britain. And so if Palestine would still be considered as a major asset to the empire, they could have been dealt with more effectively. But Palestine, or the Jews in Palestine, became, to put it simply, a nuisance. And because they weren't strategically too important, you had bases alternative bases in the Canal Zone, in Cyprus. Then the preference was just to abandon Palestine, let the Jews and the Arabs fight each other, whatever the outcome. So it isn't a question of them expelling the British, but they certainly were a nuisance, and a considerable one. But not more than that. In founding the IDF, there was an effort by the Irgun to serve in the IDF as its own battalions, but these battalions, 2 battalions, these were dispersed after the Altalena incidents. I won't go into that. And the Stern Gang provided for about a few companies in one armored battalion, and they were very dedicated and efficient soldiers. But of course, as guerrillas or as underground movement, they didn't know how to fight a proper war, and had to learn in the course of the War of Independence. That's it, more or less. The level of training was battalion and brigade level, and in some cases very professional. For instance, with the artillery, it was very professional.
Molt bé. So we have the last question. It's very interested.
I have a question. Maybe here my ignorance is shown, but I'll ask it anyways. And you said that it was surprising that the Haganà was able to fight the war of 1948 because it was a combination between militia and army. Could you explain and go further between the difference between militia and army?
Well, militia is basically citizens, armed citizens, who served within the confines or within the parameter of their communities or the community's assets. They're not, as a rule, organized in camps as regular units, but only when the need arises. Their level of training is very basic. The commanders come from within the ranks. That is, their leadership is accepted on a social level, so that you could say they're natural leaders. That formation, that form of service was very effective when, as long as the war was static. So for instance, the Haganà in Tel Aviv or the Haganà in Haifa proved very effective, and eventually the occupation of Haifa was done before. Again, there's a question of British policy, but happened before the end of the mandate. Once you move out, it has to perforce take the form of an army. In other words, regular service, serving within camps, organized units, with all the additional service arms, for instance, the trucks I mentioned before. While they're stationary within their communities, they receive all the help which is needed from the civilian infrastructure, including transport. Let me give you just one example. As you know from Napoleon, armies march on their stomachs. In a militia, the quality of food was determined by the community and therefore was usually very high. So through various civilian standard channels, and with the help of women voluntary organizations, the militias were fed and usually ate quite well. Once they moved out and became mobile units in areas other than the areas of original recruitment, the army had to provide for all their needs, including food. And there's a great deterioration in the quality of food, which consisted, again, dependent on what the state was able to import, but in many cases based largely on canned sardines. Now, there's a limit to how many canned sardines you can eat. I don't know if you've tried it, but after a month or two, one becomes a bit tired of sardines, although I personally like sardines. And therefore, and you receive complaints of soldiers saying, life was so good when we were a militia, and now as an army, we have to rely on sardines. So the changes on various levels, but you could say that basic change is that the unlike militia, an army is deployed away from its area, its original area of recruitment, It also requires a different type of motivation. In one case, you're defending your home, which you actually see or actually even live in, moving to other parts of the country. The aspects, the ramifications are many and complicated, but basically it becomes a mobile force and a regular force. I'll stop it there.
Okay. Molt bé. Doncs, thank you, Dr. Kadish. Doncs ho deixarem aquí per avui. En tot cas, moltes gràcies de nou per haver vingut. Crec que ha estat prou il·lustrativa aquesta segona jornada del seminari. I bé, com sabeu, això després ho pengem a internet, amb els subtítols corresponents també, i la propera jornada serà d'aquí un mes, el dia 16 de novembre, i tractarem sobre el cas d'Estònia i més concretament de la Lliga de Defensa. En qualsevol cas, el que diem sempre, som una organització sense vincles en cap institució, nosaltres ens autofinancem i així doncs, si voleu que seguim fent actes com aquest, doncs us animem a unir-vos i a portar el vostre talent. Moltes gràcies per ser-hi sempre i seguim.